You'll need this word. Hello, my name's Anthony Kerrigan, and tonight we are joined by Nick Groom, Professor Nick Groom, on the GhostÉire Channel. Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
Very well, Anthony. Very good to see you. How are you?
Hi, all good there. So tonight we're going to be talking to Professor Nick Groom about vampires, also Frankenstein, and also William Shakespeare. So some very interesting subjects. If you'd like to contact the show, you can go to our website, www.ghostére.net. Go to our contact page, fill in the blanks. If you have a private message, just put in brackets, private message. Also, folks, tonight we have a competition, or I would say a quiz there, where you have a chance to enter our Halloween mega draw and Halloween mini draw, which we've done in another few weeks. But you have to stay tuned. I'll give you a word, and then you have to be the first person to type that word, and you're in with a chance to enter our draws. So if you'd like to catch up on future shows or past shows, go to our website, www.ghostére.net, press on the red button, and you'll be able to check out the shows there. Bridget Burt from Seekers of the Afterlife. Hi, Bridget. Just hi to our both. Hi, Bridget. Carol Daly says, hello, guys. Hi, Carol. How you doing? How you doing, Carl? And Joanne says, hi to all this evening. Hi, Joanne. How you doing? So, yeah, tonight we're joined by Nick there, Professor Nick Groom there. Prof of Goth, is that correct, Nick?
That's what I've been called. I didn't choose it myself.
So we're going to be talking about vampirism there, Nick. And I suppose the first question I'm going to ask you about vampirism is, what made vampires predominant in the past few hundred years? Is it Eastern culture mixed with Western culture, or is it vice versa?
Yes, well, Anthony, I think that you've identified where the interest in vampires comes from. We can put a very precise date on the discovery of vampires, although there have been bloodsuckers in, not just Western society, but across the globe for hundreds, if not thousands of years, going back to biblical times, to ancient Greece and so forth. The vampire itself is actually only first mentioned in 1725, when an officer of the Habsburg Empire, so that's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is investigating the exhumation of a corpse on the East European border of the empire. And this corpse has been exhumed and staked with a stake sort of like this to basically to nail it to the ground to prevent it from moving again. And the reason why that's happened is because it's been out and about strangling villagers and then sucking their blood. And this is after it had been in the grave for 10 weeks. So the offending vampire is called Peter Plogogovich. And that's the first time that the word vampire is used. So it's an official report. And then what happens over the next few years is there are a number of other outbreaks. 1727, a famous outbreak with someone called Arnaud Paulet. Then again in 1730, and the Arnaud Paulet case then re-emerges in 1731. And every time you get these officials, so you get the military, you get surgeons, you get magistrates being sent by the Habsburg Empire to go and investigate. So it's a bit like the X-Files, really. This is the authorities taking these events, these manifestations, very, very seriously.
Okay.
And so they produce written reports, they interview witnesses, they exhume corpses. Again, they stake them, they find fresh blood in the mouths, they find that blood spurts from the chest when they are staked. And so this is really where the whole sort of interest and fascination for the creatures come from. So there are then many, many articles published in the early 1730s, particularly in medical and scientific journals. And then from Vienna, these sort of spread like wildfire, as I describe in my book. It becomes a media sensation. It sort of races across the whole of Europe, and really gets to places like Leipzig, Paris, and arrives in London in 1732. And everyone's got their own theory, whether it's to do with mass delusion or diet or accidental drug intake. In London, the suggestion is that this is a political allegory. But other commentators say, well, there are so many witnesses, there's so much evidence that we have to take this seriously. And then this debate runs on for the next sort of 75 years, really, and engaging theologians, scientists, philosophers. So it's a big debate in the Enlightenment, and it's really when Enlightenment forms of thinking, when forms of reasoning, making sense of the world through rationalizing, come into contact with East European folklore beliefs. And that's mixed in with epidemics and trying to explain the spread of contagion, as well as certainly things like oppression through these buffer states and diet as well, and different religious beliefs. And that really creates a cocktail of influences that really then very quickly and firmly establishes the vampire as a figure, but primarily at the beginning as a figure for scientific investigation. So there's forensic examination done of these cases.
Yeah, as we looking at the 1600s, we had plagues and all that in Eastern Europe and Western Europe there, and then it goes into, I suppose most common people know about the Spanish flu in the last 100 years and all that there. But it was disease. Would that have characteristics to being a vampires? Was it something they couldn't choose as well, apart from drugs and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, disease at this stage in history, I mean, we're talking about a comparatively modern period. We're talking about the beginning of the 18th century, the Enlightenment, but it wasn't understood how disease spread. So that's not until John Snow in the mid-19th century investigating cholera in London. So these sudden outbreaks of these fatal diseases in these villages were terrifying. And they could spread very, very rapidly, like Ebola, and with very strange and unexpected symptoms. And so it wasn't understood how these things were communicated, how these diseases were communicated. And so there are various theories. Was it to do with sort of damp and what they called pestilential air, from being confined in a closed space? Well, that's quite interesting in terms of our current predicament.
True, yeah.
Was it to do with the breath of the infected person? Was it the words that an infected person spoke? Could that somehow actually infect somebody? Or was it their sight? If you were seen by somebody infected. And so some doctors, some physicians had their patients blindfolded so they couldn't actually spread the disease through looking at people. So
Right.
this really shows, first of all, how inexplicable the spread of disease was, but also that it's invisible. That we're talking about forms of spreading that are sort of through air or through spoken words and so forth. You can't actually see these things. And to be honest, in this context, putting it down to vampires is pretty reasonable. It does seem to be a feasible and believable explanation for these sudden outbreaks that would then, turn the victims into vampires that could then spread it further until it was contained by mass stakings in these village graveyards.
Was there any, like, as you said, you mentioned diseases there, and I suppose if it was disease as well affecting people, then it wouldn't be a privilege. Then it would have affected upper classes and lower classes. Is there any cases of upper classes society being credited as being vampires?
That's a really interesting question, Anthony, because I'm talking about East European peasant villages, and that's where the vampire outbreaks begin, and it tends to be spread to immediate family, close friends, and so forth. So we're talking about relations. And then the vampire gradually goes up the social scale. There was a story in the mid-18th century that a Polish princess was supposed to have contracted vampirism. So it certainly seems to have been blind to that sort of social hierarchy. But as anybody who's read Anne Rice will know, that it certainly begins as a peasant contagion, but then does gradually, as I say, it has sort of social aspirations. It's sort of socially mobile, and then it sort of moves through the middle classes and eventually to the aristocracy.
And as many people know about, I suppose they've seen all the films, Bram Stoker and all that, we probably might touch a bit on Bram Stoker. I named my son Stoker actually after him.
Good for you.
He's not into fires or anything. Stoker, he wasn't named after putting shoveling fires. But as we're talking about, I suppose, how does in literature there, where is it first mentioned about how people can be empowered by being a vampire? As I know there's a bit of video footage of yourself in a bath of blood. But was that true? Was that true that people used to bathe in blood to be?
Oh yeah. I mean, blood is very good. I mean, for centuries, blood has had almost sort of magical properties for folklorists, for folk healers. That bathing in blood, particularly, and I have to say this is what people believed, particularly menstrual blood was supposed to be particularly effective. Also, the blood of executed criminals was very powerful, and of course, in the Catholic tradition, the blood of saints. I mean, that in fact is a holy relic. So St. Thomas of Becket, after he was murdered, the blood was rinsed from his vestments, and that was considered to be very powerful for sort of curing various ills. But this goes on into the 19th century. For example, I mean, Hans Christian Andersen recalled seeing a sufferer from epilepsy being given blood from a freshly executed criminal to drink. And at the end of the 19th century, it was quite fashionable for the middle classes to go to slaughterhouses and drink warm ox blood to cure low spirits. So certainly sort of drinking blood, bathing in blood, has seen as having these sort of reputed almost sort of supernatural qualities because blood is inexplicable. And the fact that blood is the juice of life, is only gradually being understood. And so the epigenetics of blood today go way beyond what most people know about DNA testing and things like that. A drop of blood can provide a snapshot of your lifestyle in terms of your diet and also your life expectancy.
I've heard something recently. There was I think sheep were one of the first. Well, no, lamb. Sorry, a lamb was. I know. I think you're going back to, as opposed to like the religious kind of side. Lamb of God I think the lamb was one of the first animals to successful in transplanting of blood into a human. I think it was.
Well, you're absolutely right there. And it's a very controversial case. So when the circulation of blood was first discovered in the 17th century, people got very interested in the implications of this. So Sir Christopher Wren, the architect, injected his dog with wine to get it drunk.
Oh yeah, I heard that about that.
And then this led to people wondering what would happen if you put, the blood of a mastiff into a very quiet dog. Would it make it very fierce? And then there's this chap called Arthur Koger, who was a divinity student who was apparently had a very freakish disposition. And to calm him down, he suggested that he should have a transfusion of blood from a lamb. Because as you quite rightly say, the lamb is considered to be the symbol of Christ, symbol of meekness and mildness. I mean, anybody who's seen a lamb in the fields knows that this isn't true. We're talking about a symbolic lamb rather than a real lamb. And he actually had 2 transfusions, amazingly survived, but it actually didn't cure his extravagant nature. And then he felt that he'd been turned into a sort of hybrid creature. And he wrote to the Royal Society, signing himself Koger the sheep, saying and asking for a pension because he was no longer completely human. Now, what's interesting about that is that's just a few years before sort of tales of vampires, really grip the imagination across Europe, because vampires, are very near human, but they're obviously not human. And in fact, vampirism is also a cross-species condition. So one of the ways in which early victims could be vampirized was from eating the flesh of infected livestock. So it was a particular infection that wasn't actually confined to humans, but could spread to humans from infected meat, from sheep or oxen. So it begins to erode this sort of human exceptionalism, the way that humans think that they are different to the rest of the animal kingdom and at the center of creation. It begins to bring humans back into a relationship with other creatures, and also potentially makes them the prey of another creature that apparently can only subsist by drinking human blood. And so humans go one step down the food chain.
Yeah, it's interesting. I could talk so many subjects off this there, because it could just talk about blood instead of vampires in there. Because we mentioned, as you mentioned, empowerment there. I think there was chieftains, sect clan leaders in Ireland that used to drink the blood of enemies to gain strength as well there.
Yeah.
I'm just coming to a few of the comments and a few shout outs. Sorry, folks, there. Just been a bit. We just got right into the subject there. I love it there. Hugh says, hi, Hugh, from County Antrim Paranormal Research Association. He says, hi, Hugh. John Ambrose Martin, looking forward to the show, guys. John Ambrose Martin for AJ Paranormal Project. Liz Reeves from RIP Paranormal. Evening, everyone. Irene from California. Hi, sis. How you doing? Mary from Back in Time says, hi, guys. Serenity. Hi, Serenity. Be talking to you soon. Halloween. Hi, guys. Kathy Houston says, hello, everyone. Carol Daly wants to ask a question. How did the story of garlic and vampires come about? I suppose that's the next question I was going to ask you there about, Nick, is what's the ways of dealing with a vampire?
Well, it's always a good idea to have some garlic. I actually brought some with me, but I've mislaid it. Which you don't really want to do if you're a vampire. I don't know where it's gone. Anyway, that actually occurs very early on in the sort of vampire tales, in the scientific and more documentary evidence. So it's as early as I think something called the sort of Lettre de Givre by a French marquis, and he talks about how garlic is a very good protection. Also, things like poppy seeds, that if you throw them over the body a supposed vampire, will have to count them before it leaves the coffin. The same thing with incense grains, perhaps wrapping it in dog rose. Now, these are all sort of fairly sort of typical sort of folkloric ways of delaying or impeding the progress of a particular monster. You know, it's the whole idea of having to count things. It's you know, developing a children's counting game into a device for actually protecting yourself against these creatures. But really, as I said before, the notion of the staking becomes, you know, is a very powerful idea, because I mean, bodies have been nailed to the ground or nailed to coffins for centuries, because it's just a very practical way of preventing them from getting up and going wandering. Another suggestion was simply to break the legs, or break the teeth. So, you know, if you didn't have a stake, and ideally you want to have a hawthorn stake, but you know, there are other ways of physically preventing the vampire from roaming around. And I think this is an important point, because with one or two exceptions, vampires are very tangible, and this is why the commentators at the time were so fascinated, because there's so much physical evidence. It was about spurting blood. It wasn't about seeing ghostly figures that left no trace. It was about, you know, a series of very definite indicators, such as having bruises on the throat, for example, where they strangled their victims before then sucking the blood. The big exception to this is that people couldn't work out how they could leave the grave without disturbing the earth. And there's a huge amount of debate about this among theologians and philosophers, that this was seen as a real sticking point, that, you know, vampires had to have some supernatural sort of dimension if they were able to do that. And interestingly, I mean, you mentioned Bram Stoker a little while ago. By the time Bram Stoker's writing, there's a much more interest, much more awareness of invisible science, of dematerialization of things like, you know, sort of telegraph signals, even X-rays are exactly contemporary with Bram Stoker's Dracula. So in Dracula, you have the Count dematerializing into little particles, which is, you know, it's explicable. So again, he's sort of part of the, if you like, the spectrum of weird science that was believed at that time. And, you know, although he is clearly a supernatural or even a paranormal entity, at the same time, he can be explained. And I think that's what distinguishes the vampire from the ghost. The vampire has a physical reality, whereas ghosts were, you know, something else entirely. And that's one of the reasons, not only of interest to philosophers and scientists, but also to Roman Catholic theologians. The Protestants, on the other hand, were much more interested in the ghostly, in the spectral, in these presences that didn't leave a trace, but simply left an impression or a memory. But the Catholic Church, which was trying at the time to come up with a rational Catholicism, a Catholicism that can be explained through contemporary science, is therefore very much drawn to making sense of the vampire phenomenon. And so there's this wonderful book by an Augustine monk called Calmet, who'd already written a huge commentary on the Bible. And he gathers together all of the stories of vampire outbreaks, and then tries to reason through these to deduce whether vampires do exist or whether they are the result of, you know, fantasies, delusions, nightmares, whatever.
And as you mentioned there, I suppose going back to Stoker as well, Bram Stoker, he did have a brother, I think, in the Royal College of Surgeons as well, and he was that's true, isn't it?
I think three of his brothers were actually physicians, and he actually wrote to one of his brothers to get details of brain trauma so he could incorporate them into his novel. And in fact, if anyone who's read Dracula will know that it's absolutely full of cutting-edge science. You know, there are blood transfusions, there are Kodak cameras, there are Winchester rifles. So although there's this East European folklore, it's the same thing happening in Dracula Because what happens in the 1720s and 30s is that contemporary thinking and science and technology is brought into contact with this mysterious and inhuman entity. And it's then, the narrative, the actual drama is about how they actually begin to make sense of him and in the end dispatch him. Of course, Dracula isn't stakes. He has his throat cut with a sort of knife, not unlike this one. Which has meant some critics have wondered whether there's a sort of sense that he's not really been slain.
Yeah.
But it's certainly quite surprising that after all the talk about Van Helsing saying exactly how you got to get rid of him, that they don't do that at the end. Which I think is one of the great things about the book. I mean, I love novels that have that sort of ambiguity in them. Those sorts of loose ends. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes great literature.
I suppose there's so many possibilities. I mean, there's so many outcomes. Like there's one outcome there, but people lead off to other outcomes there. Suzanne from Back in Time says, "Hi everyone." Hi Suzanne. Mary from Back in Time as well, paranormal team. She says, unfortunately, a cocktail ignorance, the uneducated and folklore only add to mass hysteria and supernatural. You only have to look at the Salem witch trials of 1629. Bram Stoker brought vampires into every household with a flick of a pen. That's true.
And I think it's worth pointing out that Bram Stoker comes at the end of about an 80-year literary fashion of writing stories about vampires. And he also spent 7 years researching Dracula. So, I mean, he was aware, I mean, not only through medical science, but he read the early reports. He investigated, the whole culture of vampirism, as well as visiting Whitby and, and looking at things like, tide tables and sort of navigational manuals so he could get everything right for the arrival of the Demeter. He took it very seriously, and he wanted to give it that sort of level of reality, and again, what I would call sort of tangibility. So he's not just writing on the hoof. He treated it as a research project.
And as you said, I suppose and during that time, then there was all loads of grave robbings and all that time there, like people bodies being used for scientific reasons there.
Well, I mean, funnily enough, by that stage, all the graves had been emptied. They were. We're talking more about the time of Frankenstein when there was a huge market, and after the graveyards of England, Scotland, and Wales had been emptied, there was a trade across the Irish Sea, emptying Irish graveyards. There's actually a scandalous case of this couple who smuggled Irish corpses into Britain in pianos.
Oh, I never heard of that. Do you know the name?
It is in this. It is in this book.
Oh, right. Okay. I'll have to get the book to know them there. Like, Cal, a nice pint of Guinness. I think that's because of what you're having there. I'll have later there, Nick. Serenity says, Shamrock Island. Joanne Bean says, that's the other opinion about the modern vampire there, Nick. What's your opinion about the modern vampire community that's very prevalent around the world? I suppose going back to Twilight and Hammer Horror, I suppose, Christopher Lee there. And is it the past 100 years? Is it romanticised being a vampire?
Yes, well, I think that Dracula is the watershed. And in fact, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is getting together a collection of pre-Dracula vampire tales. But Dracula is certainly the climax of decades of writing about vampires, and nothing's ever the same after Dracula. I mean, Dracula does really sort of fix a certain sense of the vampire. I mean, not least because he has two vampire genders in the same book. So you get what I call the she-vampires as well as the Count. So Dracula is very important. The other thing that's very important is the arrival of the cinema, of the moving image. And Gothic, 19th century Gothic fiction proved to be a great resource for early filmmakers because you didn't have to make big monsters. You just have people acting. So you get Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You get Frankenstein with Victor Frankenstein and the Being, and you get Dracula. And although obviously sort of Max Schreck in Nosferatu does have, most extraordinary makeup, as did Boris Karloff for the Being in Frankenstein, you don't need, King Kong monsters. You don't need dinosaurs for this sort of stuff. You can actually have human actors and then begin to explore early special effects, such as, speeded up or decelerated filming, cutting techniques. And I mean, obviously in Nosferatu, the Symphony of Terror, you get these fantastic chiaroscuro effects using the shadows, and making the black and white of the film, a major sort of artistic feature of the finished product. I mean, it is a most extraordinary film. I would urge anyone to watch it if you're not familiar with it. Right. Sort of the F.W. Murnau's sort of German expressionist film is it's well worth watching.
Yeah, there was, I suppose, it's films really then took off then, and I suppose they use, it's what you don't see and you hear, and it's more with their mind. It plays more with the mind, and that's what leads to Frankenstein and vampires then being so major in society.
But I think one of the interesting things about films is that you can go into the cinema, you sit there in darkness, you're watching vampires, and then you can, and they're killed at the end or slain at the end, and then you can go back the next day and see it coming back. Or it'll come back in a sequel, or it'll come back in a remake.
Yeah.
And Dracula keeps on being killed, and then he keeps returning in different guises that then begin to reflect social values of the time. So whether it's Bela Lugosi, or sort of one of the Hammer House vampires, they are all they're very much of their period, and what they do is they contribute to this sort of growing set of associations of the vampire, but they never supersede it. They never sort of properly put it to bed. They never kill it off. It will always return. And it returns in different forms, which is why things like Twilight are so interesting, and True Blood, and Being Human, which are beginning to explore a more sort of ethical or green form of vampirism, where maybe the vampires live on blood substitutes or raid blood banks rather than preying on individuals, and perhaps they become more alluring as well.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, looking back there, I suppose like comic books as well. In comic books, I remember Marvel Blade is another vampire there.
Yeah.
Hugh says, I have seen graves with iron cages over them. I was told it's to stop vampires from leaving the grave, but I think it's more of a case of people stopping grave robbers from stealing their bodies to sell to medical research for lectures in the Victorian times. What's your thoughts on the vampire and the cages over graves? Any truth in it?
Not that I'm aware of. You may well know something that has eluded me, but in the vampire reports and literature that I've read, a cage isn't going to be much good. Really, you do need to fix them to the ground, and they're called aberrant burials, and there are these go back to Anglo-Saxon times. They actually go back to the original Gothic tribes where corpses have been found staked to the ground. So it's clearly something which does transcend immediate historical context, and so because of the practicality of it.
Eugene from Afterlife Paranormal says, Interview with a Vampire is a great film. Oh yeah, that is a great film there. Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. Do you like that film there, Nick?
I do, but I have to tell you that my two favourite vampire films would be Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, partly because he's hyper aware of the late 1890s context, and he does play with early cinema technique. So he's clearly aware that one of the reasons for the success of the vampire is the early cinema. The other film I really like is The Hunger, which has Sarah Sarandon and in fact David Bowie as well, who becomes sort of impossibly old. And that's a film that's very much about the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. And so blood is very important in that, in the way that it was in the AIDS advertising and the actual terror that people felt at that period. And it's also about the rock music business, The Hunger is. So it begins with the band Bauhaus singing Bela Lugosi's Dead in a cage, to go back to the earlier point, in a nightclub. And so it's commenting on the sort of the whole nature of popular culture, which is that the old artists like David Bowie are basically sucking the blood out of the upcoming younger bands in order to actually try to sort of stay relevant and stay in the charts. So I think it's a very interesting film. It's also very interestingly gendered in terms of it's female vampires in that very much have the primacy. So those would be my sort of two more recent films to recommend. But there are a lot of films out there, and I can't pretend to have.
The Lost Boys, I think that's what my wife, I think that's to do with vampires. Is it The Lost Boys?
The Lost Boys is very good. Yes, that's quite unusual because that's a gang, and you usually get vampires going around individually, or at least with some sort of entourage of servants. But the Lost Boys, it's about American teenagers in a local gang. But again, that's a really good example about how the figure and the genre can be reinvented for a new generation of adolescents who hang around in shopping malls.
Shopping malls, yeah, Tesco, Sainsbury's. Joanne says Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Bartholomew, are interesting historic characters associated with the vampire legend. Because it was Bath Moy. I think Anne Field played her in the film there recently. Did she bathe in blood? Was it rabies apparently she had or something like that?
Yeah, Elizabeth Bathory was reputed to bathe in blood, and this was reported in a book called The Book of Werewolves, written by an Anglican clergyman called Sabin Baring Gould, who himself wrote vampire stories, among many other things. He wrote the hymn Onward Christian Soldiers as well. But he wrote some very interesting vampire stories, one of which the vampire says, "When will people understand that we are the influenza?" And so this is actually just before Spanish flu. But, he's got vampires proclaiming themselves to be a virus. But he does describe Bathory bathing in blood. So since Bram Stoker knew that book very well, he may well have come across that instance. But there's very little evidence that he knew about Vlad the Impaler. This is a later attribution, I think, and it's the Vlad the Impaler tales don't appear to have got into Western European consciousness until into the 20th century. Bram Stoker did have a particular friend called Armand Vambury, who may well have told him about these stories. But it seems to me to be a later reading, although it on the face of it, it's very plausible. It seems absolutely believable, and you really don't want to find out what Vlad really did to people. I mean, how he impaled them. I made the mistake of doing that. It's absolutely terrifying. But it seemed, I don't think that it had a direct influence on Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it clearly has done since.
Mary says, I love Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, my favourites there. John Ambrose Martin from AJ Paranormal says, amazing information. Hugh James says, thanks for that. Catherine
Deneuve, yes, you're right. Yeah, Catherine Deneuve, as well as Sarah Sarandon. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Hunger bit. Irene says from California, 30 Days of Night, good vampire movie. No pretty vampires there. Like the Lost Boys.
That's a very good example.
And Mary says, have you visited Transylvania? Have you been there?
No. In fact, I was planning a trip to the Carpathian Mountains a few years ago. I'd love to have gone until somebody told me that the sheepdogs are actually trained to bring down people because there's so much sheep rustling there, not to mention the wolves.
Yeah.
So he said, whatever you do, don't go walking alone in the Carpathian Mountains.
There's bears there as well. I have been to Transylvania. That was actually the last holiday we went to there a few years ago. But it's amazing. The people are wonderful there. But I suppose the castle that mostly people associate with Dracula, Bran Castle, what they call it Dracula's Castle, isn't. Vlad is not actually supposed to have visited there. Apparently there.
But Bram Stoker never went that far. He based his information on travel books.
True. So I'm just going to show a video here. This is towards this is Nick lighting up a book. So you can see him there. It's going to go on fire in a minute, but this is an interesting. And the last few couple of sentences are very interesting. It puts like vampirism into perspective as what we think of as humans there. So this is courtesy of Four of Swords, and this is Nick showing off.
Although there have been legends of blood-sucking demons for centuries, what I argue in my book, The Vampire: A New History, which you can of course purchase, is that vampires were effectively discovered at the borders of the Habsburg Empire in the 1720s. And this was when Enlightenment science confronted East European folklore. These apparent outbreaks of vampirism that overran entire villages were investigated by the authorities, by the military, by magistrates, and then investigated further by theologians and philosophers. And so there's a great deal of interest in the physical properties of the vampire, and also whether these outbreaks may be caused by mass trauma, diet, drugs, and so forth. Straight away, the vampire phenomenon races across Europe like wildfire. It's always doing that. Because vampires are thought experiments. They're ways of thinking about what it is to be human, and they're also metaphors in politics and in economics. For theologians, they prove the existence of an afterlife, although maybe not the sort of afterlife that we're looking forward to enjoy. And for philosophers, they question the nature of testimony and evidence. And so throughout this period, vampires are appearing in different theatres of thought, and always medical science is there at the background, because vampires really do shadow the advances in scientific thinking, whether that's to do with blood transfusion, with psychology, with a whole range of questions about experimentation and forensic symptoms. Ultimately, what the vampires show us is that our humanity lies in the fact that we will die. Vampires aren't human, they're very near human, but of course their bodies don't corrupt and they rise again. As humans, our fate is to rot in the grave, and that is what makes us human.
Okay, so that's Nick lighting up a book there.
I've got the book here, but I don't think it's oh, here we go.
Hey, that's good on the heat and build there.
It happens whenever I open it.
So we're going to go on to the new subject, next subject first. But I'm just going to show you. This is from where can people get the book there, Nick, for the Vampire New History?
Yeah, I mean it's available. It's Yale University Press. It's now in paperback. I would go to Waterstones or I mean any bookshop can order it. If people do order it, then I hope you enjoy reading it.
Okay. And I just got a few more questions before we go on to the next subject there. Eugene says Salem's Lot is the scariest vampire movie I've seen. And Hugh says, love the piece of music from the film The Hunger. I don't know how you pronounce that. Is using the advert for the British Airwaves there.
I didn't know that.
I don't know. Anyway, it's using the British Airwaves ad anyway from the film The Hunger. Okay, all right. So, folks, I'm going to give you a word now. This is for the competition, and I suppose it links in well with what we're talking tonight. So, the word, be the first person to enter to go into the competition. The word I want you to type is corpse. So the letters are CORPSE. Be the first one to type the letter corpse. So we're just waiting to see who the first person is. Hey, Joanne's got in there again. Joanne got in there. Joanne was in last week. So nice one, Joanne. Joanne, Bridget, you just beaten there. Hugh says he's a bit of a classical fan anyway. So all the words are coming in for corpse there. If everyone's reading this back on the messages alone, they'll think, oh Jesus, what's happening there? Anyway, so the next subject we're going to be talking about is Frankenstein. And is there a link to Frankenstein and the castle, Frankenstein Castle in Darmstadt in Germany?
Not directly. I think that Mary Shelley was probably aware of it, but I think there are likely to be more influential sources for her. There was actually a novel published during the French Revolution about a character called Frankenstein who animates a corpse. It's rather like a Jewish golem. So I think that it's more likely she got it from there. But it's certainly, it seems that the Darmstadt castle is associated with alchemy and the occult and those sorts of pursuits that Victor Frankenstein is interested in at the beginning of the novel, before he turns to modern science, before he turns to chemistry and anatomy and studies in electromagnetism.
Because I know there's a piece like there is supposed to be a person, I think it's Dibble is his name, Conrad Dibble, Johann Conrad Dibble, who's supposed to be a person who used to live in the castle, if it was the 1600s or something like that, and alchemy and anatomy he was doing stuff, and he was supposed to have done exhuming bodies and that. Was Mary Shelley, was she a respected author at that time?
Well, she was part of a very powerful cultural set. Insofar as, of course, her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who unfortunately died a few days after she was born. But she's the pioneering feminist, author of Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her father is William Godwin, the great human rights philosopher. And she then gets involved with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who's a sort of rather feckless aristocrat and poet, not a very successful poet until after he's died. But she also gets involved with Lord Byron, who is the most successful poet of the period by a very, very long way. And from that company, she then sort of is able to mix with, the radical fringe, if you like, of British culture and literature. But yeah, I mean, she was respected. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The book was it received mixed reviews, partly because it was such a clear break from the Gothic that female writers tended to produce at that time, which was either the school of Anne Radcliffe, in which what is apparently supernatural is explained I mean, I always compare Anne Radcliffe with Scooby-Doo. That it turns out there's a lot of, straightforward explanations for things that appear to be supernatural.
True.
And so, female writers of the Gothic either tend to be more rationalist and also tend to be interested in education, which is, of course, is what Mary Wollstonecraft is interested in the vindication of the rights of women. But there were other writers of what's frankly horror, such as Charlotte Dacre, who's more influenced by The Monk by Matthew Lewis, which is the first English horror novel. And Mary Shelley can be seen more in that tradition of horror writing, I think. I mean, she's called a science fiction writer today, but of course there wasn't such a thing as science fiction any more than there was such a thing as the Gothic novel when she was writing. They were called German novels or terrorist novels or hobgobliana. But I mean, what's interesting is that she starts Frankenstein when her and Percy and Byron and John Polidori are staying at the Via Diodati, and Claire Claremont, her half sister, was there as well. So this is on the banks of Lake Geneva, and this is in the year without a summer in 1816. And the reason for that was that there'd been a gigantic volcanic explosion on an Indonesian island the year before that had sent ash, miles into the sky, blotted out the sun, and created climate change for the next decade or so. So it was Byron wrote an extraordinary poem called Darkness, which is it's not dissimilar to Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road. In fact, it just imagines this completely desolate, devastated landscape. Anyway, so they're in this villa. They're on Lake Geneva. Thunderstorms all through the summer. They decide to have a ghost story writing competition, and that is when Mary Shelley, after she doesn't start running it straight away, she waits, and she then claims that she has a dream, and she dreams of this scientist assembling a body out of the parts of corpses and animals, and then animating it. And then, of course, she continues to write it and completes it. But as part of a ghost story writing competition, it doesn't have any ghosts in it. It doesn't have anything that's supernatural. What it has is, that's what connects it to the vampire stuff, is that it has weird, extreme, inexplicable science in it. And by this stage, Byron had already written about vampires. And his contribution to the ghost story competition was an unfinished story about a vampire. So they were clearly talking about vampires. That was taken up by his doctor, John Polidori, who then finished it. And in 1819, the year after Frankenstein, publishes it as a short story called The Vampire, which is the first English prose tale about a vampire. And it's got quite a complicated publication history, and whether it's really about Byron or not is a moot point. But it's certainly influenced by Frankenstein, and so the vampire gets momentum from what Mary Shelley is doing in her novel, and her interest in blood and anatomy and galvanism, which is the chemical production of electricity that was used to make not only frogs' legs twitch in public experiments, but they actually did experiments on executed criminals.
I know, because was it something as well with using electric sparks to check if people were dead as well, and obviously
this was simply a public demonstration of the power of electricity. I think the victim's name was George Foster, and so in front of an audience, and of course he'd been taken down from the gallows and was dead, they actually made his jaw quiver and then his eye open. It's a really sort of Frankensteinian moment. Somebody who's dead is then apparently animated. So Mary Shelley is fascinated by this, and also her soon-to-be husband Percy Shelley actually studied anatomy for a term after he was sent down from Oxford, and so he knew all about the problems in getting corpses and so forth, and the grave robbing that we were talking about earlier, and the actual trade in body parts. Which, certainly, until recently was the case. You could actually, get human skulls for medical students to use. You can't get them anymore. You're only getting plastic ones or virtual ones. We have to ask a very good friend whether they're willing to give it up after they pass away.
But is that a real one? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm so real. It doesn't have great dentition, as you can see. This is the thing about purchasing skulls. Very few have full teeth.
Oh, I know. I know. I only have a fake one in the background there. But as we're talking about, I suppose, like you mentioned, transplants and all that. There, I suppose it all goes back to vampire. Well, the novelists of the time, Stoker and Shelley. There, they brought in the science as well, meeting Eastern culture and Western culture there. So is the transplants, was it mainly to do with Frankenstein? Was it, or was it what I'm trying to say there, was that part of it as well, transplants?
Yes, I mean, we've already talked about blood transfusion, and in fact there were big medical advances when Mary Shelley was writing in terms of transfusing, first of all between dogs and then eventually between humans. Transplantation was one of the big sort of targets, one of the big dreams of medical science, partly because there are two saints, Damien and Cosmas, who had apparently transplanted the leg of a dead Ethiopian onto a European. And so you then ended up, and you often see this in iconography, with a patient who's got one white leg and one black leg. And this became a symbol of the possibilities of medical science. And so Damien and Cosmas are often the patron saints of medical schools. But the thing that people did transplant was teeth.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Transplanting teeth particularly into the aristocracy, there was a big trade in that. And John Hunter wrote a treatise about this at the end of the 18th century, saying it's preferable to use live teeth, in other words, taken from a living donor. Those of young women are best. And so they were often forcibly removed from female servants.
Jesus, yeah.
And then placed into the sockets of their masters and mistresses.
Yeah, I know there's a case of somebody dying from that as well. Like, wasn't
yes. I mean, it wasn't very safe because there are all sorts of either diseases that could have been communicated, or simply blood poisoning, septicemia, and so forth. But also dead teeth were used. In other words, teeth taken from corpses. And many of those who died at the Battle of Waterloo had their teeth extracted, and which were then sold for, I think it was £2 a tooth to surgeons.
Oh, right. I know. Yeah. Mary says, didn't Mary Shelley keep her husband's heart in a silken scarf long after he passed away?
That's absolutely right. He was cremated on the beach after he drowned, and Mary Shelley wasn't there for the cremation, but it wasn't Byron. It was one of Byron's friends. Can't remember his name offhand, who snatched the heart. We presume it was a heart. It could have been perhaps the liver, but he took his heart. And Mary had it wrapped in silk, and also she kept it in a copy of the poem Adonais, which was by her husband, and kept it on a desk. And, took it with her wherever she went. So that's a real sort of memento mori, if you like.
Yeah, I don't know if my missus will do that with my heart. I don't know. I don't know. She might. I don't know. She might do it sooner than later. But so we the book as well. It was a 200th anniversary, wasn't it? 2018 of the book there, and you did the revised version of it. Is that true, Nick?
Yeah. So this came out in 2018. It's the text of the first edition. It includes the third edition changes as well. The second edition was edited by her father. But yes, I mean it's a fascinating novel for so many reasons, and I think it's the most influential novel in English ever produced. And the fact that it's written by an 18-year-old woman is absolutely extraordinary. And it does pose so many questions about the definition of the human, about rights and responsibilities, about moral culpability, about authenticity, and about the medical science of the day. And the reason why it remains evergreen is because these questions are still relevant. We're still asking the same questions, but under different circumstances to this day, to do with things like the integrity of the human body, and whether we become more or less human, whether we start having bits of other people or bits of machines or bits of animals put into us. So it sets the agenda for these big questions, which we are still grappling with. So it's a fantastic laboratory, Frankenstein is, and the fact that, like so many great what we now call Gothic novels, it's a series of unreliable accounts. So Mary Shelley doesn't take an authorial perspective and tell us what to think. She's got different characters telling their own stories, which in fact are told in a series of letters by Captain Walton, whose mental state is at best dubious in any case. So it's this interlacing set of narratives and plots and claims and counterclaims by the characters. So it's really all the time it's asking readers to make active decisions about, who they believe, where their sympathies lie, what they believe about what they're saying, and then what this means for how we understand ourselves and our society.
True, it's very interesting there, and I suppose, you feel sympathy for the Doctor, and then you feel some sympathy for the creature. Then, it's an interesting plot. And Mary, just what I'd like to say there, I suppose whatever has come, as you just said lastly, there is that if it puts thoughts into people there, and I suppose the amazing stuff with transplants and all that, over the years, it puts it into the agenda as well.
Absolutely.
Still transplanting body parts in modern medicine today. So Mary Shelley's vision has become quite real. That's true there, Mary.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that Frankenstein's being is also created from animal parts. So it's not just human parts. So that can get us to reflect on, current scientific research into the fact that we share much of our DNA with non-human species, for example. The being is also basically a miniature ecosystem made up of different parts. And again, contemporary medical science does theorize that our bodies are ecosystems with all the viruses and bacteria and parasites that we're host to. So it's a way of dismantling and then rebuilding our conception of what it is to be human, and then wondering how that might affect the way that we relate to, for example, the environment. For example, when Victor Frankenstein is walking through the Alps, he says that the mountains look more like the giant habitations of some unearthly species. Well, there's something a bit Lovecraftian about that, but he's realizing that perhaps humans aren't at the center of the material world. Perhaps we are simply a sideline, and really there are these sort of super powerful creatures that are really in control. So we're sort of decentered, and that's very much the sort of thinking that we're going through at the moment. That if we don't begin to realize that we're sharing the planet, and that we're not top species, we're not able to control the climate and ecosystems, then unfortunately it's going to lead to extinction.
It's coming either way, isn't it? Really, I suppose it's the environment showing us what we can do if we're too overbearing or too unacknowledgeable, and then you've got the virus as well. Then that is actually creeping up on us there from behind and actually doing what we're doing to the environment.
It is, and the thing is, I think that the current pandemic has started to get people to think about this. Mary Shelley's follow-up to Frankenstein was a novel called The Last Man, which is about a global pandemic.
Oh, right.
And eventually there's one person left, and he carves the epitaph for the human race, knowing that nobody will ever read it.
I know it's an interesting subject there. I could go on for more about this, but we're going on to Shakespeare soon, and it's to be or not to be. That is the question. I said the answer earlier on. I got that completely wrong. But before that, we got the quiz there. I'll come to your questions there in a minute. There, comments there. So, Joanne, if you're still there, you have a choice of 6 places: the bedroom, the school, battleground, flying saucer, road, or library. If you can just pick one of them, type it down. Nick, you have a chance as well there. Which one of those places you can enter our draw as well, Nick? Which one of those places do you want to pick?
I'd rather like the bedroom, please.
The bedroom. It's been a late night there. Nick is picking the bedroom. Joanne says the library. Okay, library. Okay, perfect. Oh, yeah, you picked that early on as well. Oh, no, that was Bridget there. So we'll go and stay tuned to the end of the show there, and we'll reveal if you're in the draw. So Mary says, in fact, we have moved from transplanted body parts to installing 3D printer parts now. Yeah, that's true. Shay would not be happy with that. I suppose, it's 3D printing now, isn't it, as well? I forgot about that.
Well, I mean, it's worth sort of thinking about the immense influence that the novel Frankenstein has had. And one of the films that I think is deeply influenced by it is, of course, Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott film. And in that, you have the replicants, which are, purely mechanical. They are, robots. And yet, we definitely feel for them. It's a demonstration that you can, feel a great deal of empathy and understanding for a machine. And we then begin to think about how this subtly changes our relationship with the everyday. I mean, you might not have much of a relationship with your smartphone, but musicians certainly have relationships with their instruments, and they talk about the actual sort of character of them and so forth. So I think that all these little sort of ways of stimulating and inspiring us to actually rethink, who we are and how we relate to not only other people but now other creatures and then objects. Technology, objects as well. Like, what will robots be like? Which they are coming in there. Paul says, "Hi guys, when's the book out? GhostÉire. It's coming out soon. The news will be out on that soon. It's not going to be the Modern Prometheus or Bram Stoker's Trackers. Are not going to be as good as that. But Nick will probably have to revise it around about 50-60 times to get the spelling correct in my book before it goes out there." And he says, "What quiz I was on late? I go corpse." Yes. Anyway, Paul. So it's great to see you there, Paul. So we're talking about William Shakespeare there. So for the last subject there, this is William Shakespeare. We're talking about what was William Shakespeare's fascination with the supernatural. Now he's got fairies like in Midsummer Night's Dream and witches in the Scottish play, which I'm trying not to mention there. But what was his fascination with the supernatural, Nick? Well, I think in a word, because it's part of human experience. And Shakespeare's not a playwright who's going to start making judgments about what he believes may or may not be true. Now, Shakespeare, there are more ghosts in Shakespeare's plays than there are in any of his contemporary playwrights. There's one exception, in fact, because Christopher Marlowe has Dr. Faustus, and that's, apart from one character, every other character in that or every other figure is either a ghost or a devil. But that's a bit of an exception. So Shakespeare has ghosts, and I will say it in Macbeth, in Hamlet, in Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra has spirits in The Tempest. Richard III is a very interesting example, because of course that's considered a history play, and yet there's a great sort of cavalcade of ghosts at the end of that. So ghosts are definitely part of Shakespeare's world. They are a presence there, and a presence that he acknowledges, although he acknowledges them differently in different plays, because they are clearly contingent on the circumstances in which they appear and the plots that they are helping to drive.
And as you say, like they appear in Richard III in a dream with the king, and they appear to people like I'll say his name, Macbeth and Hamlet. They perceive them, but nobody else around them perceives them. So the ghosts in Shakespeare plays, like they play like havoc on consciousness.
You're right about Macbeth, because only Macbeth can see Banquo's ghost, but in fact in Hamlet other characters do see it.
Oh, okay.
Which is why Hamlet goes up onto the battlements. Has this thing appeared again tonight? They don't necessarily hear what it says. It appears just to address Hamlet, but it is a manifestation that does appear to have some reality for other characters, and yet is at the same time a very ambiguous figure. And the ghost of Hamlet's father in Hamlet can be seen as the originator of all the later ghosts in English literature. Many writers refer back to that ghost and to Elsinore as being the ghost that really sums up and sets this tradition going. So Horace Walpole, for example, in The Castle of Otranto, refers directly to it, as does Anne Radcliffe. And one of the reasons for this is that the actual ghost, Hamlet's father, says that he's in purgatory. So he's a Catholic ghost, and yet he's in a Protestant play. And Hamlet himself has studied at Wittenberg, which is the cradle of German of the German Reformation. And so, in that sense, it's a play that encapsulates the very nature of the Gothic supernatural, which is Protestant guilt at progress, and particularly at the expense of Catholicism. So that's the Reformation. That also then encourages like sort of commercial society, imperialism. All these things help to advance England and then Britain to become, a very powerful and incredibly wealthy nation, and also one that takes its human rights responsibilities apparently seriously. And yet, there's so much guilt at the cost of this progress, and whether that cost, let's say, is the Reformation and the devastation of the monasteries and abbeys and priories, whether it's a slave trade, whether I have to say this, whether it's the terrible oppression in Ireland, and so this guilt is unacknowledged, but then it comes back in a supernatural way. It's the history that you can't bury. It's the stuff that you appear to have dealt with, and then it gets up out the grave and comes to haunt you. And that really sums up the Gothic throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, that it's trying to deal with progress and what cost progress. Are you prepared? Are you prepared to, for example, in Frankenstein, are you prepared to have people digging up bodies and performing, animal experimentation for the sake of potential health benefits, medical progress? So that's really what the Gothic is. At its very heart, that's what the Gothic is, and that's why Hamlet is such a good example of it, because it shows that Protestantism can't escape its Catholic past.
True. I suppose it's going back to the Elizabethan times and Jacobean times. Then I suppose it's trying to mix everything, get everybody come together. I suppose that sort of way there. Most of the ghosts are there to avenge their own death. Were there bad omens in plays that Shakespeare ghosts?
Well, they're certainly there to redress the wrongs of the past, and they are one of the instruments or one of the characteristics of the revenge tragedy. And Hamlet is a revenge tragedy. And so revenge tragedies tend to have supernatural occurrences. They tend to be extremely bloody and violent. And if you want to see how bloody and violent Shakespeare can get, then read Titus Andronicus, which is, it makes Quentin Tarantino look like Winnie the Pooh, frankly. And they also have this sort of very hallucinatory quality, because you can't be sure of the reality around you. And so again, that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of Frankenstein and the unreliability of the Gothic storytellers, unreliable narrators. That this sense that we can't get a perspective on things that's somehow objective. We can't. Gothic literature, really underlines that, and it's really what it's like to live. But we fool ourselves all the time we are being objective, but of course we can't be objective. I mean, our subjectivity, has a sort of pretend objectivity about it. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult, I think, to go about day-to-day lives. But we fooled ourselves that we're doing that. But when you get writers like Shakespeare and some of the later Gothic writers, you're forced to confront those shortcomings in your understanding, and that's one of the reasons why I think they continue to grip the imagination.
As in, like Shakespeare, I suppose, as I know there was plays about ghosts apparently as well prior to what Shakespeare written there. But I suppose, was it because we're trying to perceive something? And I suppose with Dracula and Frankenstein, they're trying to perceive what it's like to be. It's paranormal, but it's all to do with the science there. Is Shakespeare different to that there? Is it more to do with people's emotions?
Well, I think the thing is, as I said, every one of sort of Shakespeare's sort of supernatural figures is contingent on the context in which they find themselves. So I think what I'm sort of trying to say by that is that they're not just there to serve the plot; they're there to show that. In fact, I mean. Hamlet says it better than I'm trying to say it. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Yeah. So, you might try to make sense of things, but you're never actually going to be able to.
No.
There's always going to be those loose ends, those things coming from outside, those things that you choose not to include in your attempt to explain everything. And that's why the ghosts keep coming in, or the fairies, or the spirits. Shakespeare's constantly reminding us that there isn't sort of one theory of everything that fits everything. There's no one size fits all. There's no sort of simple way, some sort of simple agenda for understanding other people or the world around you. And it's better to accept that than pretend that there is.
And just I suppose one of the last questions there, there's supposed to be a rumoured curse to do with Shakespeare's skull that it went missing there, and he had a fear of his body remains being taken away.
It's this one, actually.
You're owning up now, is it? You're joking me. That's William Shakespeare himself there.
Yeah, you got an exclusive there, Anthony.
Lucifer there. But is that true there? Was his body, because of the fear of, reason why he wrote ghosts, and he had a fear in his body parts being taken down, he used his ghosts, like avenging ghosts, to put fear into people to stop them doing what they might be thinking of doing. If you get it that way, they're like,
yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and you made me think about how things like graveyards and mortal remains work in Shakespeare, and of course Hamlet has the great graveyard scene in it. When they meet the gravedigger, and he produces Yorick, and Hamlet is, are these the lips that I kissed? This was a clown in the court, and now he's a skull, and it's become an absolutely iconic skull. So Shakespeare is including human mortality, but also importantly the post-mortem state in his plays, what happens to us after we die? Well, it's the that's what Hamlet's to be or not to be speech is about. But there's another aspect to that, is what happens to our bones.
True, yeah.
And of course, remember, sort of cremation was illegal until the late 19th century, although of course you could be burnt at the stake for various crimes. Being dissected was the fate of many executed criminals, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. But Shakespeare does appear to have a particular concern about what happens to your bones in the grave. And this comes up in sort of various other sort of plays as well. And it does seem that this curse that he lays in his own epitaph, assuming that he wrote it, and most scholars agree that he did, cursed be he who moves my bones, is, a final statement on the fact that he does want to have some physical presence remaining in the world. It's odd in Shakespeare because you don't see it in other playwrights of the time. No. But one of your listeners referred to Mary Shelley keeping Percy Shelley's heart. It's a bit like that, or having a lock of somebody's hair. Perhaps it's having some. We've gone right back to where we began with tangibility and physicality, and having some sort of like material reminder.
Like a guitar.
Shakespeare doesn't want his mortal remains to disappear or be forgotten or mixed up, for that matter.
And you've just stolen it anyway, so you got the curse. I'm really joking there, Nick. Paul says, actually, I was an English literature at A-level and never realised this is a great show. Cheers, Paul. There, I don't know why you're going to be reading my book anyway. But this is where introducing Shakespeare, and I suppose this was. Can you tell us a bit about this book you wrote there, Nick?
Well, I wrote it a few years ago, and it's a graphic guide, so it's a bit like a graphic novel, but it is a pretty sort of basic introduction. I was asked to write it actually to demonstrate that Shakespeare's fame is a result of a series of historical accidents, such as the printing his works just before the theatres were closed, or the rise of the British Empire, or the spread of the English language. But by the time I'd finished it and read a lot of Shakespeare and Shakespeare criticism, I realised that it's just because Shakespeare is far better than anybody else. He is the cream that rises to the top. He's an absolutely unparalleled writer. So I didn't really fulfil my brief for it, but I'm glad that I wrote it.
Yeah, and then he's got the skull on the front cover there, just seeing which is interesting there.
I didn't have anything to do with the graphics, apart from the fact that I think they based one of the figures on me wearing a long coat and a big hat.
Bridget says that's why I want to be cremated there. I think that's to do with the body parts going everywhere else. I know there, Bridget, there it's But
even if one's cremated, there's still the question of what to do with the ashes.
True.
I mean, maybe it's a good idea to put them in an egg timer so you can keep doing something useful.
Yeah, an egg timer is a good idea there. I know. I think my wife just wants to put me not bury me, but stuff me up. Just put me in the living room to scare people. I don't know. Madame Tussauds gone real. I don't know.
I mean, to go back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, I mean, of course, this was a big concern, particularly in the 19th century, before cremation became widespread. And that was mainly for practical reasons, in terms of overflowing cemeteries and graveyards. But the real fear wasn't just grave robbing, it was premature burial.
Oh, yeah.
And if anyone who's read Edgar Allan Poe knows that Poe writes about this in very chilling ways. But there was in New York City, they were worried about this in particular in the 19th century, and so they decided to leave corpses in hospitals for a week before they were buried. And they found that 1 in 200 people revived.
Oh Jesus, yeah. I know. That's You know, it's kind of, must be a horrible situation to be in there, like, you know. And I suppose it goes on to our next subject that we're going to be turning on to at the last, because you're going to be doing a talk soon up and towards Halloween. But I'm gonna I'll go and talk to you about that there. Michael Smith says hi for Bannister. Hi Mike, how you doing? He says he loves graveyards, just so we were talking about that as well. Joanne says, for anyone who carries a donor card, imagine knowing parts of you are still alive as such. So that's the other aspect of it as well. Yeah, donor cards are going back to, I was going to say that, like transplants have been so handy in helping people as well carry on living as well. It's not just,
definitely,
you know,
yes,
the morbid side of it there. So we have the quiz there. So Joanne, now's your chance. And Nick, we're going to see if you're in for the Halloween mega draw or mini draw or not at all. So Nick, you picked the bedroom, and Joanne, you picked the library. So Nick's going to the bedroom, and Joanne's going to the library to research more. So let's see how you got on. So it was a choice between the bedroom, school, battleground, flying saucer, road, and library. And no luck with the flying saucer, bedroom, or battleground side. Oh. No, mini draw was the school. Joanne, I think you're in it again there. So you got 2 goes in the draw for the Halloween mega draw. You're in the Halloween mega draw there, Joanne. Oh no, you're in the mini draw and the mega draw, which is good there. I'll just check my list there. So yeah, that's good there. Just a little prize there where you can win some blood and some body parts there for the mega draw there with Nick and Shakespeare School as well, which Nick has kindly donated to us.
I promise to give it back.
I will bring it back. Stratford, that's where he was from, wasn't he? Shakespeare.
Yes. Yeah.
Stratford, yeah, Stratford upon Holy Trinity. That's the name of the. Yeah, that's the name of the church there. So, Nick, you've got something coming up. I think it's the 26th of October. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. This is for the London Month of the Dead.
Yeah.
I'll be talking about the city at night. It'll really be like an imaginary tour through the city. It'll be talking about night walking, which was actually illegal for many years to be walking around at night. Also about what might be going on behind closed doors, and a little bit about lying in, which is keeping corpses in houses after people have died, in order to allow the family to pay their respects. So it'll be heavily illustrated as well with slides. And it's a Zoom talk. So if you go to London Month of the Dead, it's possible to get tickets for that.
Yeah, so that's the 26th of October there, coming up there. And just reading it there, I was just reading the preview of it there. I've got the website here. I just put the website up as well, Living of the Dead. And it was that's just, I was just thinking there when you said like it was illegal to walk around at night. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, in fact, even before there was a police force, it was the community had rights to challenge and then imprison people if they were walking around at night.
Oh right, yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah, so it was just fascinating. I thought, oh God, I would well be done then if that was myself. Well, I don't go walking out in the night anymore there because it's the school runs at the moment. So so that's gone out the window now. But you know, I do be walking around in the night myself sometimes. Anyway, if the wife doesn't let me in anyway, Jennifer. Anyway, so that's another different story. Anyway, Joanne says brilliant. Can I have the school? She says. Nick, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. I'm really fascinating about the vampires and Frankenstein and Shakespeare there. Paul O'Brien says Clifton Street Cemetery, warders minded graves. Well, interesting there. So that's in Clifton Street Cemetery. Yeah, I suppose grave watchers, watchtowers would have had them around there. So on the next show, we've got Anne Massey from Irish Paranormal Investigators. She's going to be talking about Celtic harbingers of death. Abbey of the Black Hag, and Father Malachi Martin, the Exorcist. So it's all up all happy times here. Going up towards Halloween. Nick, really thank you. I appreciate it there. And thank you for coming on this evening there. I know it's been busy there. Professor Nick Green, everyone. Nick Groom, sorry. Professor Nick Groom.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the interesting questions from you and your viewers. It's been lovely to be part of this. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, Nick, there. And Joanne says, thank you both for interesting subjects. Good luck with the book there. And Paul Bryan says, well done all. And Irene from California says, great show, guys. Interesting. Thank you. So that's about it, folks, there. I'll see you probably another week on Monday's time where we have Massey on the show. And thank you, Nick. And I won't see you next time. I'll see you in a near distance. Goodbye for now, folks. Bye, 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 bye.
Take care.
Bye, bye, Eugene. See you.